I'm hoping if you're watching, you are here for the workshop or live session on directing for small spaces. Um, I am just waiting for the Facebook feed to go live and then I will start. Here we go. We're now live on Facebook as well. Great. Hello, good to know that there are some people here and that I'm not speaking into a blank void. Apologies, my phone camera's a bit pants, so I look a bit like I'm under Vaseline, but I think it gives me a sort of 1950s Marilyn Monroe kind of vibe, so I'm enjoying that. Great, so I'm basically here, we've got about half an hour, and I'm just gonna go through what I think are the main questions, pitfalls of directing for small spaces, and what can kind of really change your thinking about it. And I'm going to do this in sort of just a series of questions, really, and go through some old productions of mine rather than talk about anybody else's shows. I have both managed to deal with it quite well and occasionally completely mess up directing for small spaces. So I'm hoping to give you some advice based on my failures and my successes. So I hope that's all right. The first thing to answer, I think, in any... I'm just going to plug my phone in. Apologies. This was never going to be smooth. Don't pretend it was going to be smooth. Great. The first thing I think to remember on any kind of... sod it. No, I'm going to leave that. And we're back on. So whenever you're directing anything, the first question to answer is why on earth are you making it? And that comes not just from a kind of, I like this play and I think it should be on, but why are you making this as a theatre production rather than a film production? Why is it not being done on radio? Why is it not being done in circus or as a comedy sketch? And it sounds like a really simple question, but you wouldn't believe how many people find it quite difficult to answer. Most of the time when you ask people, why are you making theatre? They go, because I want to tell stories. And obviously there's 1,000 different ways to tell stories, and some of them are much better at different things than theatre is. If you want to reach a massive audience, theatre is not your form. Your form is film, you know. It exists forever. It can be rewatched the same whenever anyone wants to watch it, and so on. So you're making something for a small collection of people in a kind of point blank range where they're only a few yards away. And so what does theatre do in that context that other forms can't do? Everyone's got their own answer to that. But I think if you try to answer the question of why am I making this and why am I making it as a theatre show, you immediately open up the possibility of answering several other questions. So for me, that answer is that I think theatre is the best cultural tool that we have for transmitting empathy to large numbers of people. And so that's why I sort of do it. Now, I've changed that sentence several times over my career, and I try and think about it in different ways, but that gives me a kind of North Star that I can then base everything else off. So when you're then going into a production and you're trying to think about, well, I know why I'm making this, and the perfect stage might be, you know, the Olivier and 1,000 kind of drops and a cast of dancing choruses or whatever. But you know you don't have that. You can begin to kind of adjust around that sort of North Star of why you're doing it to the space that you have. You know, you pour that ambition into different size cups. So the first thing that goes wrong with the majority of people who direct in small spaces is they don't know where they are. And this is the cardinal rule. If you're directing in a small space, you have to go there. You have to go there before you've read the play once. You know it's gonna go on somewhere. You should immediately go and visit it, even before you read the play again. And the visit in person is much, much more important than you'd think. This is why Edinburgh is so difficult, because usually you can't visit at Edinburgh because it's an expensive train, basically. And because you can't visit, you look at ground plans and you go, oh, right, well, there's a lovely square of space there. That's fine. So I've got a lovely square space. I've got a couple of wing spaces down the side, and that's lovely. And that's what I did a few years ago with a show called Specie. I said, this is a lovely square space. So in my rehearsal room, I drew out the square space, and then I did a lot with diagonals and corners and doing all that kind of stuff. And I thought I was being a geometrical genius. I got there, and the curtains hung like this, getting closer to each other at the end. So actually, though, it was a kind of cone, if that makes sense, narrowing as it got upstage. The rake for the seats was so appalling that you couldn't really see onto the first 2 meters of the stage anyway. So instead of having a sort of 4x4 square, I had a 2.5 meter deep by 1 meter wide conical shape, right? So at that point, you've got to say, I messed this up, I got this wrong, but you've just done 4 weeks of rehearsal and the show's ready to go. So, and you've it's very hard to come back for that. You're immediately then making adjustments you didn't really want to make. The second thing that's very important, or with that, is just to, even in some London venues, is to understand the space you have and the peculiarities of it. There's the Soho upstairs space is a place where I directed a show called Winky. Now, the Soho upstairs space is a good space. It's wide. It's got a decent seating bank and a very low ceiling. Now, what you've got to remember about the Soho theatre space, though, which I basically forgot, is that the only entrance in and out of the space goes into a corridor where there is a fire safety light that never turns off. So every time anybody exits or enters in that space, you ruin any world that you've tried to create, because you get a spill of flat white light in, and whatever you've done, however delicate you've been, whatever tone you've been creating over the last half an hour, is gone, basically. And so it's peculiarities like that where if you know that, you can absolutely do an incredibly successful production in there. Joe Murphy directed a show called Blink that I assisted on. And he directed in that space. Because he knew the space and he knew how it would behave, the two performers were at the back of the stage on 2 desks, in the centre, sort of with a backdrop behind them. They never left the stage and they never entered. And as a result, it worked perfectly, because it's a flat, low ceiling space, so you can't really use the first couple of meters of stage space because there isn't much space there. You can use the upstage, and you can use, and then they've got a kind of a distance to try and jump across, and nobody ever entered or exited because he knew that that would wreck whatever kind of atmosphere he tried to create. So these kind of understandings about the space are absolutely fundamental to directing for any kind of small theatre space. Just hoping, I think we're all still there. Great, sorry. So these things are absolutely essential. You have to know where you're going. You also have to know that and keep that in your mind as you go forward. So this especially happens when you're building model boxes. I directed a show at the Young Vic in a small space called the Clare, which is a lovely square space. And we built this beautiful model box, which had a lovely kind of... we all here? Great. There was a lovely sort of tall wall at the back and the centre of the space. And we went to Bristol and we made this model box and we looked at it and we thought, God, this is great. What a wonderful job we've done. This is looking really great. And we submitted it for the second round of a competition that we were in. Amazingly, we got through. But as the person then, as the head of design on the competition then pointed out, our pictures were taken... Oh, sorry, we've got a few issues with the phone here. Apologies. There we go. As the head of design then pointed out on the award, what we were where we'd taken the photo from was about 50 feet outside the theatre, right? And we were looking down on this model box as if that's the view that the audience would have. the view the audience would have was right down in the model box. Yeah. So if you stuck your head right in it, and then and then got your chin right down by the chair, then suddenly you would have the view it was. At which point, about 20% of our design was actually possible to see. Okay. So it's not just about knowing the it's not just about knowing the sort of the design of your space or the peculiarities. It's also being honest with yourself at all points through the rehearsal, what kind of shape of space you're dealing with and what the viewpoint of the audience will be. I've just had a message that Instagram Live is being a little bit annoying, so if you are struggling on Instagram, I'm also live on Facebook on the King's Head Theatre page. Great. So being honest with yourself about where you are and what you've got to overcome is kind of the first and most important rule. The second is it's the thing that's most often messed up, I think, in small spaces. And this is a problem that I've kind of categorized as eager designers and the problem of stuff. What tends to happen a lot with small spaces, especially with directors who are trying to make their first or second show and make a big aesthetic statement, is that they enlist a designer who is maybe in a similarly early part of their career, and ideas just explode out of the director's mind and the designer's mind, and because they've just seen Ivo van Hove nail Arthur Miller in the Young Vic, or they've seen Sam Mendes do incredible things with an office space in Lehman Brothers, and they just go mad. And what tends to creep in isn't a really sort of worked out aesthetic style. It's a lot of stuff that suggests an aesthetic style. Okay? So, for example, I did this myself. This is why I know this problem. I did a show called Winky, and the aesthetic was cheap primary colour tat, right? So we had lots of cups, plastic. It was sort of plastic, crap, cheap, that kind of stuff, right? And we had sort of multicolored bunting. We had a sort of blow-up inflatable doll in it. We had like fizzy drinks on the floor. We had bunting. We had a shopping trolley. We had so much stuff, right? Now, thankfully, the show was saved by an incredible lead actress, a girl called Amy Tobias, who managed to deal with all of that stuff. But looking back now, I was hindering her far more than I was helping her, right? Because I'd gone, my aesthetic is important, and she'd gone, well, I'll try and get the text out despite your aesthetic. And it gave her some moves that were sort of semi-useful, but mainly if I just sat her there and let her do the story, it might have been easier. The other aspects of the play where I had just done that flew a bit better. And so you have to realize that if you're in a small space, one thing is a lot of stuff. Yeah? If you're on the Olivier, sure, you can fill it with all the stuff you want. But if you're in a small space, you've got to pick the right things and only have a few of them. And more often than not, the stuff gets in the way. Stuff can also come in the guise of a large set piece that sits in the middle of a pub theatre. You see it 1,000 times. Someone puts a tent or a whole pub or in a space that just doesn't have the space for it. And what you're left with is 2 foot of playing space that goes around the edge of all of this crap that's sat in the middle. And sure, the crap in the middle gives you an aesthetic, but you get the aesthetic in about 3 seconds. And after that, the crap is just holding you up and stopping you engaging with the story a lot of the time. Obviously, there are exceptions to this rule. There are shows that have done it successfully. I'm not saying 100% of the time, but in my opinion, the sort of thing that you see most of the time, especially at Edinburgh and in pub theatres and in all small spaces, is front and centre design and actors having to try and work around it. And so I think that's the thing, and I've done it. It's a very easy mistake to make. The third thing, I think, is sort of the fundamental of how you solve the problem. If you're really sit there and you're going, yeah, but I'm doing Henry V, I need a bit of stuff, but I've only got 3 square meters of space. I know what I want to achieve by doing it, but I'm not sure how to get there. I think the key thing to look at is, what have you got for free? I'm going to embarrass a director who I think is actually listening in. There's a fantastic director called Lucy Atkinson who did a show called Vespertilio. Vespertilio was a gay love story set, but was also about bats. Like, one of them was a bat enthusiast, and he sort of comes across the romantic interest when he's looking for bats, right? Now, this play was performed in a very small space, a little traverse space in the vaults. In that the playing space is very small. It's a traverse. There's about, I say it's probably about 2.5 meters wide. However, the space itself is a cavern, or called the cavern, which is about, I would say, 50 yards long. And it's got a big domed roof, right? There's a railway tunnel in the play where they discover the bats. You can see where I'm going. And so immediately that Lucy knew she was doing that show at the vaults, that space and what it gave her for free was the obvious choice. And once you're in there, there was some design on the floor and around the edges, but really the space was giving her so much for free, in my opinion, when I saw the show, that it was a really brilliantly sort of designed show, even though there wasn't much design involved in it in the way that you might think about, you know, building a pub or building a spaceship or whatever it might be. Similarly, when I did Orlando at the Vaults, we had a one-person show that was about a person talking about their passion for a book and about a love interest that kind of dovetailed into that story. Now, we were in a vault space, even smaller than the one Lucy was in, but it had a domed roof, because these are all the vaults, their venues are underneath Waterloo Station, so they're underneath train tunnels, or they used to be train tunnels. It had a domed roof, high walls, and you could do a traverse playing space down the middle. So immediately went, well, okay, it looks a bit like a church. We could feasibly make this look like a church. That doesn't mean we're going to build a church, but if we can heighten the church-like aspects of the space at the particular moments where we are thinking about the action in that way, then this could really work in our favour. As a result, the concept of the production then became, this is an act of communion. We are trying to get the audience to imagine the storyteller as a different person, because she's trying to escape her past. So a bit like when people take the bread at communion and they imagine it's the flesh of Christ, it's the same idea. Lucy walks out, this is Lucy Roslin, walks out, and she wants to be transformed into something else, and she asks the audience to do that. So you have a kind of church-like presence for that to happen in. Now, if you go into one of those spaces and you choose to ignore what you have for free, you're fighting it. You're fighting it from day one, right? Admit you're in a small space. Work out what that gives you for free, and then go with that. 9 times out of 10, the small space gives you intimacy, an ability to batter your audience on the head with the emotional punch point, which you can't do in the Olivier. And it gives you an ability to go quiet and delicate on text. Polly Findlay once said to me, like, always think about the presumptions you've made about a production in the course of rehearsing it. For example, does this line need to be audible? Right? And everyone goes, well, every line must be heard because the playwright, blah, blah, blah. If you talk to good playwrights, they will tell you there are more important lines and less important lines. So are there lines that are less audible? You can mumble in small spaces. You can get detail in small spaces. You can play sort of filmic moments in small spaces. These are the things every small space gives you for free. And then on top of that, some of them might be churches, some of them might be bat tunnels, some of them might be other things entirely. So what do you have for free? Okay, I'm going to keep going for about 5 minutes and then try and take some questions, so do think about them if you have them. Common difficulties. Separation. And changes of location. So it's very hard in a small space to create separation. And by that I mean separation between one or more entities on stage and off stage. So the hardest thing to do in a small space is to go, this is the audience and that is the live space, and there is a definitive line between the two. In the Olivier, easy as pie, right? There's about 10 yards of darkness between audience and stage and performer. At the Old Red Lion, no. You're basically standing on their handbag in order to deliver the lines, right? So if there's no separation, there's a couple of questions. Do you want it, and how do you achieve it? Firstly, do you want it? more often than not, don't try and do it. Just admit you're all in the same room. Because once you've done that, you can encourage people to imagine much easier. If I go, okay, we're in the same room here, I'm a performer, you're an audience member, great, but I'd like you to imagine that this room is actually the Starship Enterprise. Then people are going to go, okay, well, you've been honest, so fine. If you walk in and go, Captain Spock, engage, everyone's going to go, what the fuck? You're above a pub, mate. You're not in the Starship Enterprise. And so if you admit to the problems that you have and engage with them, and engage with the fact there isn't much separation, then you can make an asset of it. If you really need the separation, you have to think of other ways of doing this. We tried this with a production called Plastic, which was at the Old Red Lion. And we had 4 individual stories going on, told in direct address by 4 different people. So you need as much playing space as you can in order to get the 4 of them in different pools of light or different sort of separate areas. So what we did is we took out all of the set on the floor, and the whole design went up into the rig. So we had small lights that could be thrown on tracks around the ceiling space, and they threw very small amounts of light. However, the space on the floor was as wide as it could possibly be. Okay? So as a result, what you could just about do is get 4 pools of light using as much space as you possibly could on the floor in the different kind of corners of the space. And that just about gave us our ability to separate. So my point is, you have to go give yourself all the space you can and then think about all the ways you can narrow it down. If you go with stage lights and a bit of set and then try to separate in a small space, you're not going to be able to do it. You need to aim for that. If that's the thing you need, aim for separation and try and achieve it. Similarly, if you need audience performer separation, get a gauze in there between the audience and performer. Get some kind of barrier in there. Maybe the whole thing's being performed over a garden fence. I don't know. But you've got to put that separation in if you need it. And that's got to be a priority. Last but not least, remember what's the most important thing. And this comes to the sort of visits to the site. When I was directing Rachel Corrie, if you would just look at the ground plan of the space, it's a big square space, right? And we knew where the audience were going to go, and we thought, right, well, in which case, and it's very high, right? So the most important thing here in our aesthetic as our space is that it's high, it's symmetrical, and it's equal. Actually, it's all made of wood. And if you go in and you don't engage with the wood, you kind of can't go anywhere because it's just warm space. Will always be very hard to make it anything else. And so once we knew that, we adjusted the design, we adjusted the aesthetics so that the floor design, which was a big red floor, was in a patchwork of the same boards that were used on the wall, and our big shaped wall that we had at the back, our kind of piece of set, that was going to be a sort of plastic Formica thing, became scaff planks broken off at the top. So what's the most important thing? Embrace that. If the most important thing is a low ceiling, embrace that. Go for length, go for a traverse, see if you can get low length and use the width. If you've got a big wide stage, but it's very shallow, that's your most important thing. If you've got a really high stage, is that the most important thing? If like Lucy had, you've got a big, long, strangely shaped, cavernous tunnel, that's the most important thing. Find out what the attribute of the space you have is, and use that. Go with that. That would be my sort of core piece of advice. So I hope that's in some ways been useful. I'm sorry for sort of being... the camera on my Instagram is appalling, so I'm sorry about that. Are there any questions? We have 7 minutes left. I can keep whittering on if there aren't, but please chuck through some questions either on the feed or on Instagram. And I will attempt to answer them. Before I forget, the designer for Lucy Atkinson's show Vespertilio was Verity Johnson, by the way, just to name check her. She did a brilliant job. It was fantastic. Any questions? I'm going to keep going then, and please pop through the questions as and when they occur to you. Another slightly difficult problem with small spaces that's really kind of... It's difficult and that I tried once, and I think I managed to just about achieve it, is changing location in a small space. Obviously, you know, say you're doing Henry V, you've got to go to France, you've got to come back again, you've got to go to the walls of Harfleur, you've got to go, you know, to Falstaff's pub. You've got to do all these different things. How do you do that? I think, as kind of classic as it may sound, the best example of this is still a Peter Brook production called Marat Sade. That and what Marat Sade does so well, I think, is it's a very sort of like out there kind of high art show, very sort of European and German, and not really my kind of style necessarily, but it's on YouTube, have a watch of it. But what he does so well is he integrates all the changes of location into the concept of the show, which is that a group of inmates in what is at the time called a lunatic asylum are performing to the audience. And within that, he can change location as much as he wants, because he's decided that the most important thing is the concept, and all changes of location are just logical extensions of the concept. So I tried, in my very, very poor way, to try and do this with a production of Magnificence at the Fimbra. It starts as a squat, and so we went, that's the most important thing. That's the most important thing, and the walls around the back. So that's what we're going to go with. So it's a squat. So then, and there was decaying wallpaper at the back. Because there was decaying wallpaper at the back, and the later scene was in a garden where he talked about the roses, we made sure the wallpaper was roses, right, coming down the wall. The spaces between the wallpaper, we left a kind of blue, starry, kind of distant thing, because in the middle scene, there's two people on a punt down the River Cam. And so we used two folding chairs, one in front of the other, to do the punt. The blue of the wall was the distance behind the river, and then the wallpaper became the third location. But we started from one most important thing and saw how that could flex, rather than trying to make three different things. Some questions coming in. What's my favourite small space to work in? My favourite small space to work in is the place with the nicest producers. It's the place where people treat you well. That it will always be the nicest place to work in. The actual metrics of the kind of what distance it is, whether it's wide, tall, short, long, whatever, are very quickly overcome by somebody either being an arse or being incredibly kind. And so I would always, rather than thinking about the dynamics of the space, find the person that really believes in your project and actually wants to support you, isn't trying to fleece you, isn't just putting you in because something else has dropped out, and really cares about you. And for me, the people that have done that include David Byrne at the New Diorama by a country mile. And also I find the Vaults a really kind of crude but supportive place to make work. Lucy Atkinson, do you have any advice for transferring a show from a smaller space to a larger one? Having so seldom done it, not much, except that, I mean, I've assisted on lots of productions that have. And I think if you have worked out your principles clearly at the beginning, then the scaling up isn't a problem. If you've gone, the most important thing here is the wood, and the most important thing here is this sense of intimidation here, or this sense of smallness over there, or whatever. Scaling up then is just about going, well, 2 meters becomes 5 meters, this concept becomes that shifts around there, and it's not too difficult. If you haven't answered those questions and you've kind of fluked the first production, it's very, very difficult. So I would make sure that you do your thinking carefully and hard at the beginning. Joseph Weiner asks, any advice for working on shows with larger casts in smaller spaces, i.e. maybe 5 to 6 at somewhere like The Hope, mainly in terms of sightline issues? Thanks. Yeah, I mean, good luck. No. So if you've got 5 to 6 people in a small space, a little bit of movement's going to feel like a lot of movement, okay? And you can very easily allow it to feel incredibly busy in a small space in the centre. Now, I had 6 people in Magnificence at the Fimbra. Yeah. Now, what we did is use all the space you have. A lot of the times in these spaces, you've got entrances behind the audience. You've got backstage area where you can use things from coming off, and you've got people can come and sit down in the audience, to the side of the audience, or just hang around slightly out of view. Now, what that does, it's not just a way of finding more space. It makes the audience feel like they're part of the room. And that's the asset of being in a small space. We're all in the same room together. So make a real asset of that. If you try and sit the 6 people on the same sort of 3-meter square in the center of the space and try and get them to kind of do big stage pictures, that's not the space you're in. You may wish it was, but that's not the space you're in. The space you're in is a room. It's not a theatre, it's a room. Think about it as a room. And so for Magnificence, for example, everyone came in, sat down, blah, blah, and the first thing that happened is that the door that they'd just come in, there was a knocking outside and about 2 minutes of conversation outside as the people broke into the squat. And then they were setting up the squat. So the next 20 minutes was them shuffling boxes in of cups and plates and tea sauces and whatever. So the first 10 minutes, half the cast is outside, fleeting, coming in and then going back out again. Now, sure, did the audience hear every line? Did they see every face in a perfect sight line? No. Was it interesting to watch? Yes. You must sacrifice the audience's ability to see everybody all of the time. That's just got to go out the window straight away. Because if you can't do it, which you can't, then welcome that fact. Okay, so if you can't see everyone at all the time, do they even need to be on stage for that line? Because you're not going to see them anyway, even if they are on stage. So what if you just catch their hand coming in through a window? How can we fracture this up? So again, realize what you've got for free, which is a small cramped space, and then kind of go with that. That would be my advice. They can work, small spaces can work really well as things that people flow through, even if they're just going back to a wall or back to a seated downstage position where they're less seen. Great. Anything else? We're nearly out of time, I think. In fact, we might be out of time. Probably got time for one more question if anyone needs one. No? Cool. Well, in which case, I'll just say one last thing, and that is that the most successful shows I've done and that I've been involved with have been in small spaces. And that you should never doubt the kind of ability of small spaces to be able to really smack an audience around the face. Like, I think, and hey, in the coronavirus times, it may be that small spaces come back before big spaces, but the ability of point-blank emotional shows to really affect audiences in ways that they, especially that kind of itinerant theatre goers, people who don't go to theatre that much, just don't expect, I think. It was always delightful with Rachel Corrie. We were doing a show in the Young Vic in their smallest space, but most of the people that go to the Young Vic go to the main house. So they hadn't actually seen that much in small spaces. And they came in and having Erin Doherty at like 6 foot away at the end of 90 minutes in a heart-wrenching story, which My Name is Rachel Corrie is. The effect it had on them was way and above what they expected. And I think that's a real delight in small spaces, that you can really kind of surprise people we are used in our culture to seeing things at a distance. And when somebody knocks on the window and goes, "I can see you too," there's a really, really sort of freeing and wonderful thing there, which small spaces are very good at doing. So those are the 4 rules. Why are you making it? Know where you are. Avoid the problem of stuff, and then think about what do you have for free. I think that's it. Michelle has sent one above. We've got one more question. How do you cope in spaces that you feel don't care, but also can't pull out? That's interesting. You form a little club. If you are producing a show, if you're directing a show with an independent producer at a venue that you think doesn't give a crap about you, the only thing you have to keep the work good, and you keep the work good by keeping the morale good, right? So if you want to keep that show good, you have to make the people involved feel that you're on their team and that you are going to make this brilliant despite the crap you're getting from left field. And that means slightly coalescing as a group together, where they feel you're supporting them. A lot of that, like 90% of that, is going for a pint after the show. It's like remembering birthdays. It's staying in touch. It's an actor comes up to you in a crazy moment in tech and goes, "I'm really worried about Act 2, Scene 5." And you go, "Okay, I haven't got the time right now." It's remembering at tea break to go back and go, "Act 2, Scene 5, let's talk. What are you worried about? Where are you at? How can we do this?" It's not just about being generically nice, necessarily, but it's about being productive and supportive. You can be critical. In fact, actors like you to be critical a lot of the time and go, so you come off stage on a Thursday and you go, "Look, I know the aircon wasn't working. I know that wanker in the first row was like on his phone the whole time, but you know the note in scene 2 and you kind of didn't play it, and sorry, but you got it." And then they can go, "Yeah, okay, fine, let's go get a pint." And that's so. I think it's, if you create a real unit out of the company and the production team, you can survive any kind of bullshit that gets thrown at you from a venue, I think. Bar financial bullshit, which nobody can survive. Great. Any other questions? James M. Lee has only just joined. Oh, you're going to be disappointed, because I'm about to wrap up. I think it was half an hour that I was meant to be doing. But if anybody else has any questions at all, I can stick around, because, it's not like any of us have anything to do. Oh, Michelle Barnett says, "Great advice." Michelle Barnett, by the way, is an amazing producer. Everyone should work with her. Employee of the King's Head Theatre, no less. Great. I think that's that then. Good luck. I hope we all get to go and make some theatre at some point soon. I've been doing a lot of gardening. That's basically what I've been doing. Okay. Take care, and I hope it's been helpful. Bye.